So yeah, I was asked to speak to you on this, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of it, and I'm really looking forward to that, much more so than the slides, but I'd like to run through some basics first. So we begin with our disclosures. I have a contract for salary support with the journal, as you just heard, and so I'm paid to think and write about these sorts of things, and my conflicted interest, if you like, is that the more you guys think and write about these sorts of things, the better I do. And so I hope that I'll move you in that direction a little bit. So I was asked to speak on peer review. When I saw the title of the talk, getting an article published, that was a little bit different, because if I knew how to get an article published, I don't know, I'd probably be selling that service someplace. So let's start over and pick some other title. So this talk will be writing for peer review. That I can tell you about. So the goals this morning, and I'm sorry I don't like to hide behind podiums, but I haven't got a clicker, is we're going to talk about how to get started, what journals look for, how to stay out of trouble in the course of writing, and in my first year editing a large international journal, I've been impressed with how much trouble it's possible to get into writing articles, and I'd like to share some stories with you about that so that maybe you can avoid that problem. And then finally, how to write up your work so that it's most interesting to journals. So getting started, most importantly, really, you can't save a bad experiment with a good paper. All right, and so the key here is experimental design. And although I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how to write up the paper, I also want to spend probably a little more time on the design phase of your experiment. And I know that many of you are already underway, but it's often possible, even if you're a little bit underway, to take a couple steps back if you don't like what you've started with and retool. Certainly IRB modifications are easier than IRB applications. And that's much better than committing several years to a project that isn't going to bear fruit. So first step is really to design a good study. And what I would assert is that good research begins with questions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a sec. We're going to go over actually we're not going to go over this morning some evidence-based medicine checklists. And I did send these around to you. Did everybody get the handouts that go along with this talk? There were a lot of them, and I don't expect that everybody's read all of them. But the evidence-based medicine handouts, I had modified some other work that we've shared. At least the 4s and the 5s have seen versions of these before. But I modified them for purposes of study design as opposed to reading journals for Journal Club. And so that's more of a reference for the future for you guys. And then the question of whether or when to engage a statistician. And I would assert that should take place at the beginning of your study design if you think there's any possibility you're going to need them, because as much as you guys don't like getting consults on Friday nights for somebody who's been sitting in the hospital all week long, that's a little bit about how statisticians feel about working with us when you've done the whole experiment and you're not quite sure what to run or what the experiment's actually about. Now you go to a statistician after it's all done and they're trying to pull a rabbit out of the hat for you. They can't do that. So what do journals look for? I don't know. I know what I look for. And I represent one journal. I sense that much of what I'm going to share with you is generalizable, but I can't very well speak for journals, and there are quite a diversity of them. The publisher that publishes Core publishes 2,600 journals, and that's one publisher. So obviously I can't speak for everybody. I can tell you what I look for. And when I hired a bunch of editors at the beginning of the year to work with us, we really changed the structure. Previously, this journal had been run predominantly by one very, very gifted man, but it was still the vantage point of one person. I felt it was important to bring in a sort of a wider diversity representing the expertise available in the specialty. And so I changed the editorial structure at our journal. But no sooner did I do that than I realized I've got to be able to tell these new editors what it is we're trying to do together. What's a core paper, or what's a good paper, if you like. And so I thought about that for a while and I came up with a version of what I'm sharing with you today. So these are the qualities that I'm looking for. I look for paper that's important, novel, methodologically rigorous but modest in its conclusions, that it's clean, and we're going to talk a lot about what clean is. This is how to stay out of trouble. Question-driven and comprehensible. In other words, the scientific reporting is clear, and I want to talk to you about that as well. So this is not exactly a checklist, but let's go through that checklist one by one. So important. Important is it's your case to make as the writer. You've got to convince the peer reviewers that you're saying something that either hasn't been said before or that you're saying it more conclusively than it's been said before is much more common. It's extremely unusual for something to be completely novel, and that doesn't make it less important if it isn't. So you should have a clear idea in your mind of why you're doing the work and why it's important that this work be done, and you got to sell that. We're looking for unsolved problems, for morbid conditions. We've talked about this in Journal Club. When I ask you at the beginning of a review of an article, is this an important question? Would you choose to read this article? And then I ask you, what is an important question? What makes it important to you? These are some of the traits that would make something important. It's common, it's expensive, it's morbid. And so you want to get that across pretty early in the paper, like the first paragraph of the introduction early, that you're dealing with a problem that's a meaningful problem and worthy of study. Importantly, the paper you send into a journal should be relevant to that journal's audience. I get about a paper a month about fossils, and because the fossils have bones in them, they think that that has something to do with orthopedic research. And unless the bones that they recover from those tombs have something to do with how we're going to treat foot fractures or deformity or arthritis, you know, that stuff should go to an anthropology journal. You should have a clear idea, or at least some idea, of what that journal's about and what they're looking for in terms of submissions. So what is the real definer of an important study? An important study is a study that will change practice. And I'm going to tell you that that standard is almost never met in the context of a single study. Practice evolves through the evolution of a literature. Very seldom does it change in a seismic way from the influence of a single study. And so I would encourage you that your paper to think that your paper can be important, even if you don't perceive, even at the end of it, that you're going to create some sort of monumental shift in practice. Now, of course, if you do, God bless you, that's great, send it to us. But most studies don't do that. So novel, again, just as it's your case to make to peer reviewers that your question is important, and that's kind of the background, the rationale for your study. Why did you do this particular study? Well, we're looking at this question in a new way. You've got to get that point across. And some degree of novelty, just like some degree of importance, is necessary for a paper to be worth somebody's attention. And so you've got to make that case pretty clearly. Just as with the question of importance, it's entirely subjective. There's very few things that have never, ever been considered before. And so novelty is kind of degrees of novelty rather than a binary condition. This is my own heresy that I'm trying to bring to the work of scientific reporting, and that's that negative and no different studies are just as important as studies that have a finding. And this is something that I think is underappreciated. So if you go through a study, if you've done a study, and it's well designed, but it doesn't conclude with a strong case to use some implant or to use some technique, or in fact it shows that the new thing is no different than the old thing, it's critically important that you still try to publish that. Can you think of why? Why would that be? Why would it be important that a study that draws no firm inference about superiority needs to get out?
The two methods or implants may have significant cost difference or similar.
Okay, right. So in that case, the no difference finding. I'm going to repeat that in case the mic didn't pick it up. He said that maybe the no difference finding is between two implants that have a big difference in cost, and so if they're not different, then it's nice for everybody to know to choose the cheaper one. That's a critical one. That's a critical one. So that resource, which is constrained, right? Everybody wants to get grants, and if the grants keep funding the same thing because they keep having a no difference finding and nobody publish it, then you're going to be spending a lot of money on grants that should be directed other ways. There's an even more important reason. Can anybody think of it? That's exactly right. That's right. So meta-analysis and systematic reviews generally survey the published literature. And we could talk about that they should also be surveying the gray literature, abstracts that never get published and such, but often they don't. And so if a meta-analysis or a systematic review can only grab up that which has been published, and that which has been published has got this effect that it tends to suppress, whether from the author's side or the journal side, no difference findings, then meta-analysis is going to tend to overstate the benefits of novel treatments. It's going to tend to say that things work better than they do because the no different stuff keeps getting shunted aside and only those things showing superiority keep getting published. Then the meta-analysis is going to overstate the treatment effect. That's a bad thing. That harms patients. These other things have to do with resource consumption, whether it's you can get away with a cheaper implant, whether the same grant shouldn't be funded twice. That's money. That's harm. So Springer, who is our publisher, has on their website, I was just looking around for other definitions of novel, and they described it exactly here. You can read it as well as I. A puzzling phenomenon, an unsolved mystery about the world, a new technology, or a problem needing better solutions. I think that's a nice definition. Sir?
Sorry for interrupting there. So since it's a novel, if you go back one
Sure.
slide, and you may address that later, I had the privilege of having a preview of your talk, but case reports. How does a case report fit into the novel concept? Does it have a role at all, or are you going to touch on it later?
I wasn't going to touch on case reports, but I'm really glad that you did, because we actually talked about it in our board meeting this past weekend, our editorial board meeting earlier in the month. There is a diversity of opinion, obviously, about case reports, as in so many other things with scientific reporting. I'm going to share with you my point of view. I think that case reports are one of the lowest possible forms of evidence. In fact, I think most of the time they don't rise to my definition of what evidence is. I think that case reports, although almost always novel, are almost never important. The exceptions to that are product failures, approach failures that hadn't been recognized, things that you might need to do a large number of before you start to see these things, but then when you extrapolate that over a much larger number like a population, there may be enough to talk about. But we saw this unusual manifestation of a tumor that we've never seen before, nobody's ever seen before. Well, I mean, world history is a long trajectory, and if nobody's seen it before, you got to ask yourself, I mean, okay, it's interesting that you saw it, but if you went through your diagnostic workup for tumors and you wound up at this place, and yes, it's unusual, it's a zebra, but it's probably not going to change care. I have a hard time. There are journals of case reports, and there are places to park these things, but I don't have a great deal of enthusiasm for them myself. I think that the other issue with case reports is that people will do something 2 or 3 times, found that it worked, and then make a case for some sort of a therapeutic intervention. And I think that's really the worst abuse of a case report, which is, I think you can't generalize from a couple few experiences and shouldn't try to. But I also recognize, Dr. Chapman, that there are people who feel otherwise, that people who feel that case reports are important. And as I say, there are places for them, but we receive many more of them than we publish. I don't know if it's a ratio of 30 to 1 or 50 to 1. It's a lot. And my own preference is for ones that have a really strong message that don't overgeneralize, and that's almost always in the setting of failures. We still publish others because there are people on our editorial board who have enthusiasm for this sort of thing, but I'm going to do maybe 1 or 2 a month. I'm not sure if that got to your question.
I guess just as a follow-up, do you have a thought on the JBJS case connector as both a place to park these that maybe makes it easier for people who are looking for a trend to find them by using kind of keywords and things like that? Or?
Well, now you got me on the record here, so I'm going to talk about another journal on a camera. So thanks for that. So what I would say is, a colleague of ours used to say the plural of anecdote isn't data.
Right.
Okay, and so I think the same thing could be said that if I publish a case series of 3 and try to generalize about treatment recommendations, that's not much different than seeing 3 separate case reports and trying to generalize about treatment recommendations. And so again, my enthusiasm for that is relatively low. We actually have partnered with JBJS. They approached us, would we share our database of case reports with their case connector? And we said we'd be happy to, because they're out there. We may as well make best use of them, make them findable.
Yeah,
but as a practicing clinician, on the other 2 days of the week when I'm not moving commas around, I don't have a great deal of enthusiasm even for aggregated case reports. Sir?
If I may just ask a methodological question as a little sidearm. When does a case series, let's say 3 or 4 cases, turn into an actual, let's say, retrospective?
When is this case series and when is it a series of small case reports? I don't know. I don't have any idea. I think it probably depends the topic. You know, I mean, there are some things you're just never going to see that many of, and I guess, what was that thing about pornography? You know it when you see it. You know, it's, I don't think I know we don't have a hard cutoff for when something becomes a level 4 series, case series, and when it's a report of 3 cases or 5 cases or 7 cases, it's probably somewhere less than 10 and more than a few. How's that for awful? Yeah, no idea.
One more thing I want to point out about negative studies. So I do remember very significantly how we had a very hard time and were ultimately unsuccessful in publishing a study about an anterior thoracolumbar plate failure in the early 90s.
Hmm.
It was really frustrating. It was a case series. It was like 3 or 4 cases, but it was very clear there was a consistent mechanical failure.
I'd have taken that ravenously. I think that's exactly the role for case reports.
I think times have changed, but this is exactly one of those things that negative studies, they are important. And again, if there's a consistent failure modality, it was our fault that we didn't get the funding to do the biomechanics testing to immediately make this very clear.
I think the world's a different place, than it was then, as you know better than I, and that back then, our faith in industry, I think, was a little stronger maybe than it is now, and messages running counter to the current were not received as openly then, perhaps, as they are now with respect to product failures. I think it's most journals are a little more open and enthusiastic about those kind of failures now than they were 20 years ago. At least that's my impression. So, carrying on the idea that studies should be rigorous, I'm going to refer you again to those templates, checklists that I showed you for evidence-based medicine. There are other checklists besides that one, and that one includes elements of a variety of different ones. That's how I pulled them together. But there's a checklist called STROBE, which is for observational studies, that is retrospective studies. CONSORT, which is for randomized trials, and PRISMA, which is for meta-analyses and systematic reviews. And so those are out there, and they're very helpful, and the better journals actually adhere to them. In other words, if you submit a meta-analysis, you'll be asked also to submit the PRISMA checklist to show to what degree you complied with the generally accepted recommendations for studies of that design. I would say that when I say modest, what I'm talking about is how you handle your conclusions. Don't overreach. That's a very, very common thing that we all tend to do, and it's not out of malevolence, it's out of enthusiasm. We've lived with this baby now for 1 year or 5 years, and we're really happy with it when we're ready to publish it. And we really want to shout it from the rooftops, and that's human nature, Look at it as objectively as you can, and I guess don't worry too much, because most of the time you'll get smacked down anyway by the reviewers or an editor if he's awake or she's awake when she's looking at it. But what is this? Modest is hottest. So I've got daughters. So what's clean? Clean with respect to authorship. The ICMJE has got a set of standards. They're listed there. If you can't remember all that HTML text, just find icmje.org and you'll find their standards. I gave you an editorial about authorship that summarizes at least my own heresies on that subject. Plagiarism and redundant publication. Who would plagiarize? Well, I wouldn't plagiarize. You wouldn't plagiarize. I hope none of us would, but redundant publication is an easy trap to fall into. You work in a lab. You work in a research group. There's only so many ways you can say certain things. You don't want to take large blocks of text from earlier articles, even if they are well written. And even if they are from your own group, that's still considered redundant publication, because that work has been copyrighted previously. But this isn't just about copyright law. This is really about taking questions from others, republishing the same patient's data. It comes back to the same issue of meta-analysis. So you've got a great data set, and now you want to slice it thin and find another question that's related to your previous questions, but you think it's different, using the same patients. You got to really be clear when you're submitting that article. We did this earlier study, and now we're doing this in follow-up. If you slice it too thin and you don't mention your earlier work, it's going to come across very badly. It's going to look like you're trying to publish the same thing twice. It may look like you're going to try to publish the same thing twice. So be very mindful. Cite your earlier work, refer to your earlier work, and say how this extends your earlier work. Especially critically, if you're using the same set of cadavers or the same set of patient data, because you really don't want to be in a situation where somebody thinks you're trying to get the same results included twice to double their influence on some subsequent meta-analysis. Very, very important. Journals have tools to detect this, cross-check and authenticate. When a paper comes in, we actually run it against all published studies, and it'll tell us how many strings of text duplicate. It'll say 7% from here, 4% from there. And as those numbers start to add up, you know, it'll get on people's radar. It's actually not the percentages, what specifically was duplicated. So it's not like a 20% we throw a switch. But these journals have tools, and all the good journals are using them, and it's less likely to get away with that than you used to. And this destroys careers. I haven't been at this that long at the level that I'm doing it now. Seen a half a dozen cases of this year. So I gave you, again, another editorial about duplicate publication and what the problems with it are. Why is it a bad thing? Because there's other areas where it's accepted. In law, it's perfectly normal to publish the same thing a couple times. But it's not in medicine, and it has to do with influencing the literature unduly as that literature gets aggregated.
So, for example, like, as part of the lab I'm part of, we have a standard methodology for running our testing protocols, and it's hard to...
You said it perfectly already, right? You've described this methodology really, really well, right, in your previous studies.
It's also highly technical, but it's hard to say what you need to say with, you know, how do we get around that when it's like a published methodology?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So you've come up with the best way to describe this process because you've published it and you're happy with your description of it, and you're not going to change it experiment over experiment. It's going to be the same. Best way to do that is to say, as earlier described, reference, and then follow it with something like briefly, and then kind of just give a synopsis of it. And if somebody wants to pull the original where you give it in full detail, that's great. If the editor of that journal says, you know, we really do need more of it here, go ahead and publish more of it from that earlier work. That's fine. If it starts to look like duplicating large blocks of text, you can always get the permission from the other journal. The idea is transparency. The idea is to say that this came from someplace else. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess it's a similar vein that I guess the time where I feel like I'm redundant in my publication, especially in the introduction, when I'm summarizing a problem that's, you know, if I've read 5 papers, they've all kind of summarized the problem very well. That I'm addressing the same problem,
Yep.
and answering a different question about it.
Use your own words. Yeah, use your own words.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry,
Sure.
to references.
Yep.
When you have a very, very similar set of references to another paper,
Uh-huh.
you guys,
That's okay.
it's okay.
Address any conflicts of interest fully and transparently, erring on the side of more rather than less disclosure. If there's any question, list it. Take a short detour into who isn't an author. The ICMJE has opined on this. Most better journals adhere to greater or lesser degrees to the ICMJE's recommendations. I'm going to give you examples of things that when I was a resident and a fellow, we saw all the time as justifying authorship that do not justify authorship. You looked at 50 of my patients, but I didn't do anything else towards that study. How many times have you seen that person listed as an author? I know I have. That person is not an author. What do you do with that person? You certainly benefited from his or her work. Why isn't she an author? Acknowledgements, that's right. That person gets acknowledged. You're working in my lab. I've got a large grant, and I'm setting you up with a bench and some glassware and some space and maybe a lab helper. Am I an author? I've seen that. No, it's not an author. General supervision of the research group. There were periods of time where in one large hospital in New York City where if you published an article and you worked in that hospital, this person was a co-author. This is not kosher. So who is an author? These are the ICMJE's recommendations for who is an author. Substantial contributions to design, acquisition, or interpretation. Critical refinement or writing of the draft. Providing final approval. Taking public responsibility or being willing to take public responsibility for at least one major element of the research. And being able to identify who did all the others in case something comes up, in case questions arise that this analysis wasn't properly done. Well, who did it? Well, you got to be able to know who did each piece. In order to be an author under ICMG, you actually have to have all these boxes checked, not some of them. So back to our checklist. So question-driven research. Yeah?
I just had a question about, it has come up before, that the number of authors for a certain kind of paper,
Yeah.
that a certain kind of paper generally only requires a certain number of authors.
Yes.
And despite beating all those checkboxes, I got kicked off of a paper because I wanted it to get published.
Right.
And it was told that we could only have 5 authors, but in the course of, medical students being involved in projects, and they take a little bit longer, and then
Right.
someone else comes on to help finish.
Right.
Everybody's involved, but there's more people than you might realistically think you need for that kind of paper, but it still happens.
Right. So,
What do you think?
well, I think what I wrote in that editorial that I shared with you, which is that CORE had a reputation and probably to some degree, in fact, did limit authors, as do many journals. The rationale for those numbers is not to set a hard stop on how many authors can be listed on a paper. And in fact, even during the period of time that you're describing, CORE had many papers with many more than 5 authors on them. But they had to justify the participation of each of those using a checklist similar to the ICMJE checklist. And so back then, the editor would push pretty hard to see, are you really fulfilling each of these elements? And if you couldn't convince the editor that you were, he would say, this looks like a guest authorship, is what he would say. ICMJE does not set firm numbers of lists of authors. They do not. And so I moved the journal to an ICMJE standard. And so we don't do that. Having said that, if you send me a case report with 7 authors on it, I'm gonna push back. Right? If you send me a level 4 series with 11 authors on it, I'm going to ask you a question about it. I don't feel that I'm the science police, but at the same time, this is a little bit of a cave-in because I'm going to tell you the truth. I believe that in most of the studies you're describing, not yours specifically, but studies of that sort where medical students transit in and transit out, most of them did not meet the standard of authorship, right? If they come in late like that, you want to include them because they're here, to learn how to do this stuff, but they weren't involved substantially with research design. They probably weren't involved at that point with data acquisition, right? So they didn't really get that first box checked. They should have been kicked off in some instances, right? And so the problem is this creates tensions in an authorship group, okay? This creates tensions in an authorship group. So I would encourage you to establish authorship up front when you start a study, that your mentor should be talking to you up front about authorship. You're involved if you do A, B, C, and D from here to there, and you're involved as first author if you also do this. Okay? That's really the perfect world. That should be established up front. People transiting in and out, usually they're acknowledgments, if you really follow the rules. We do not have a limit of authors. I do not routinely query for 5 authors or 6 authors or 7 authors, but if something looks aberrant, I will ask a question. So question-driven research, specific testable endpoints. Some of the best questions, unlike those in relationships, are not open-ended. They can be answered yes or no. Did survivorship increase when antibiotics were added to the cement? That's a great research question. The method should then be designed to answer those questions. You should orient the paper around those questions, every section of it. And as you're writing, think question and answer. Science is about questions and their answers. It's not about narrative, and it's certainly not about novellas or epics. Okay? And so you really want to orient around questions. We're going to talk much more about that. And the asterisk here, which really shouldn't be an asterisk, it should be a headline, is my predecessor really is the one who I credit with popularizing this in our own specialty. It's not as though the idea of hypotheses is new to Dick Brand, that he didn't invent it, but he certainly leaned harder on authors to orient the research around questions than any other editor that I have seen. So let me give you an example of questions that I've seen in the last couple of weeks, and then better questions. So this one came in. This report reviews Oxford knee follow-up data over a 3-year period in a high-volume arthroplasty practice. Is that, even though it's not a question, is it a specific enough purpose? Because I don't mind purpose statements. Right. So here's what we turned it into. In the setting of a high-volume practice, we sought to determine, 1, the radiographic failure rate of this implant, whether increased surgeon experience would decrease that failure rate. You see the difference? I can't tell you how much more common that first bullet is than the second when papers are submitted. I cannot tell you how much. I mean, it's 10 to 1. Another example. We evaluated the outcomes of same-day bilateral knee replacement, compared them to patients undergoing stage bilateral knee replacement. Well, that's better than the previous one, but it still ain't good, right? So this is a better way to say that same thing. I won't read it, it's long. But can you see how the idea of focusing it on testable endpoints is different? So what's common to both of those things are words like results, outcomes, satisfaction. So I'm going to come back a little bit to that. So in terms of, only because we're running a bit on time, I like the Q&A in the middle as opposed to at the end, but I was throwing off my timing. So comprehensible. This is about scientific reporting. This is 7th grade English, but again, I see 10 papers that don't do it for everyone that does. The first sentence of your paragraph should be a topic sentence. It should summarize what that paragraph is going to be about in plain language. But you say, oh, that makes sense. I would do that in my introduction. I probably would do it in my discussion sometimes. You need to do it in your results. And this is really where papers get much easier to read, is when people take the first sentence of their results, and it doesn't start with, in our multivariate analysis, blah, 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 statistical vomit we found. It is rather that they say a plain English sentence summarizing what that paragraph of results is going to be about. We found adding antibiotics to the cement decreased infection rate. No p-values, no stats, no nothing. Just say what you're, and then you go in and you list your supportive analyses. And you list your supportive analyses. At least then the reader knows what's coming. So I think this is especially important in results. Most people are decent at this in their introduction, but people sort of get into the results and they think it's about math and p-values. It's really about servicing the reader. Subheads are nice if journals permit them. Not all journals do. I would avoid abbreviations. I think "we found" is perfectly fine. Actually, it's preferable to sort of bloated, flabby, passive voice prose. Nothing wrong with the first person. Let's talk about writing the paper. This offends a surprising number of authors. This is not the time to express yourself. This is the time to find a formula for clarity that works and adhere to it. And it's a mechanical exercise. I actually really like expository writing. I do some other writing on the side. I love good prose. I even like poetry. This is not the place. This is not the place, all right? So clarity and predictability. Clarity makes enough sense, although, again, it's easier to say than it is to achieve. Predictability, you know, where do you find the research questions, right? Last paragraph of the introduction. If you decide that for creative purposes, for artistic license, you want them somewhere else, that's not helpful, right? Readers are they're used to reading scientific papers, and if you're going to present them with something other than a scientific paper, in the interest of expressing your inner muse, satisfying that inner muse, you're not helping that reader. We're really about servicing the reader, and you got to be that way too, if you want them to understand your paper. Each section has its purpose. So it's really about clarity. And so I want to run through a paper, or how to write a paper, section by section. What are we looking for in each section? What do you want to accomplish? What's the abstract? The abstract captures the essence of a paper in a page. I think the internet has made us efficient in some ways, but it's definitely made us impatient. I think that we don't read quite the same way that we used to. I think we graze more. We're used to kind of flipping pages, perhaps. And many readers aren't going to drill deeply into the paper, and certainly they're not going to come to the level of intimacy with it that you have over the year or several that you've been working on it. So you've got to give them some tool that lets them get what they need to know, including its limitations, in a very short space. So corollary to that, nothing should be in the abstract that isn't also in the paper. In other words, one should reflect the other and vice versa. Some people recommend that you write it last, that you write the paper and then write the abstract. I don't feel strong. I've seen people really get animated about that. Whatever works for you, but just make sure at the end of it that they match. In the abstract, the background, that the first section of a structured abstract is the background. If you think about your introduction section as having a paragraph of background, a paragraph of rationale, and a paragraph of study questions in general, well, the topic sentences of those first two make the very nice background section for an abstract. What was the sentence of background? What was the sentence of your study rationale? That's it. You really need more than that. It doesn't have to be long. The methods, again, if we're thinking about science as asking and answering questions, the methods should be focused on the questions, should reflect those questions and how you answer them. Results, consider a sentence of results on each research question. If you had 3 research questions, before you start, say, I'm going to have 3 sentences of results, and that's what it should look like. It's question 1, 2, 3, answer 1, 2, 3. Very clear, very direct, very short, very linear, very easy to follow. Common error in conclusions is to restate the results. Well, we just read the results. It was the sentence right before the conclusions. And so instead of saying, we found adding antibiotics to the cement decreased the infection, well, you just said that. What should the reader do with it? Is this a situation where we're certain enough everybody should now add antibiotics to cement? Well, that's uncommon, but it could be really the definitive study on that. More commonly, this points to the need for a study that will answer this specific question on this subject, and then we'll know, maybe. Right, so the conclusion doesn't have to be rush out and change your practice. It could be, we need a little bit more in order to be comfortable recommending a practice change. Here's what we need. That's an example of a conclusion that doesn't restate the results. In the introduction, I think shorter is better. The idea of the introduction is to set the stage. A shorter introduction is a better introduction. Lots of confusion about what should be in the introduction and what should be in the discussion. I don't have the answer. I have my answer, which I happen to like. So what I would say is a 3-paragraph structure in general meets most needs. Let me tell you what I mean by that. The background paragraph, why is the topic important? It's common, it's morbid, it's expensive, whatever. Second paragraph, rationale. Given this important topic, why did we set out to design this specific study? What's missing in the literature? Where's the controversy? And then a paragraph on study questions. It should be so clear in transition from that paragraph of rationale to your questions that that paragraph of questions should start, we therefore sought to determine. It should be that direct. And there are times where you need a 4th paragraph, commonly in a basic science study where, you know, in a journal that includes some clinical and some basic science like ours, sometimes a 4th paragraph before the questions is helpful to give people a little bit more understanding of the basic science issues that are going on. But that's very seldom necessary in a clinical paper. Paragraph of background, paragraph of rationale, paragraph of questions usually meets the need. And that helps you separate what has to go in the discussion. Anything doesn't fit into that rubric, goes somewhere else. So if you're on a 4th paragraph, ask yourself, is it necessary? So let's talk about words that don't belong. I think I gave you an editorial on this subject. We report outcomes on, we present the results of. Why don't those words belong? They're too general to be useful. Okay, this was in that editorial I sent you about level 4 studies. The method section, how did you answer the questions? So again, we talked earlier about checklists, either the evidence-based medicine checklists or Strobe or consort checklists. When you're writing your methods, when you're designing your study, think about availing yourself of a checklist that's related to the kind of study you're doing. It'll keep you from missing things you shouldn't miss. And I still do this. I've written a lot of these, and I still, if I'm going to design a paper, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, well, this is a retrospective paper on surgical therapy. I'm going to go through and find a checklist that just makes sure I don't forget something important pertaining to follow-up or outcomes or assessment. Be clear on how each question was answered, and there's nothing wrong and a lot right with, in your method section, to answer the question, we did this. Very clear, very easy on the reader. In the methods, address the kinds of bias that are likely to be on readers' minds. Make sure you cover transfer bias, selection bias. Make sure those things are taken care of as you write your method section. A common confusion in the kinds of studies you guys often do, that most orthopedists often do. Most of us are doing, our last 1,100 thises or that's, right? Whether it's our last 1,100 condylar knees of this design or our last 1,100 carpal tunnel releases done this way. There's often a confusion between study inclusion criteria and surgical indications used during the period in question of that retrospective study. And these are really separate things. You got to define who you're studying, and that can be done really clearly, whereas in a retrospective study, you don't always have crystal clear surgical indications because they often vary over a period of time. I think you should and can be really crystal clear on who you included in your study. And it's perfectly fine in a retrospective study to say, during the period in question, the general indications for this approach were, and describe it. Because I think people understand that you're not going to have that locked down in a retrospective study. And if you can then say, we think 75% of our patients were done because of this set of indications, great. But at least describe why you use that approach. So we talked about that. Flowcharts. Starting with how many patients could have had this approach, winding up with how many patients were in your study. Words to watch out for. There's an editorial about this, running a bit short on time, so I'm going to let you look at that editorial. Consecutive, prospective, and significant are commonly misused words. And I'd like you to just skim that editorial. And if you want to remain friends with the editors who you're working with, try to avoid using those words unless they're really necessary. Consecutive in particular is designed to deal with the issue of selection bias. That everybody who had this kind of shoulder pain got this operation. Does that ever happen? You don't treat every single patient the same way. Almost never. Almost never. Rather, the way this is abused is they'll say, we're presenting the results of our last 1,100 consecutive patients who received this approach that was highly selected. Right? The last 1,100 people who got my MIS approach when I, in fact, did 2,500 knee replacements during that period of time. They're only consecutive because they were numbered. They had nothing else, no other relationship to the word consecutive other than the fact that there was a number in the spreadsheet. Right? So do not use that word consecutive unless you're dealing with a diagnosis. Perspective, significant. There's an editorial about that. It's very short, easy reading, worth looking at. Bad words. All right, in the results section, the purpose of that section is to answer the questions, even the silly ones. I think, just like the introduction, in my mind, as I'm thinking about writing an introduction, I'm thinking about 3 paragraphs. As I'm thinking about a results section, I'm thinking about a paragraph of results for each question that I asked. Ask 3 questions, 3 paragraphs of results, 3 topic sentences, summarizing those, really easy reading. Topic sentences in plain English. Ask yourself, would a table or 2 help? If you're starting to summarize large numbers of patients or large numbers of complications, a table is better. It's important to give the answers to the questions, not the analyses you use to get those answers. And this is commonly done, and it does not make the papers easier to read. I would say patients treated with no bleedum spray lost less blood during surgery than those treated with placebo. That would be a topic sentence. No p-values, no analysis, no nothing. Clear summary of the main result. Not so good. Regression analysis found that no bleedum spray was associated with a significant effect. What's wrong with that? Who cares what analysis you use? You said that in your methods. You told us what analysis you're going to use. We want to know the answer now, not how you got there, number one. Number two, this sentence doesn't tell you the direction of the effect. It just says it was a significant effect, and we already don't like the word significant. But did they lose less blood or more blood? A lot of people just show the p-value and don't say which direction. Then the reviewer's got to go drudge up the table in order to find it. Make it easy. Make it easy. Answer the question. The corollary to this is there's usually one best analysis. Just saw a paper that looked at a Kaplan-Meier curve, looked at a regression analysis, looked at 3 other ways to, and one of them showed what they wanted. And that's the one they went with. They listed all the others. And there should be one best analysis statistically to answer the question you're after. That's the one you should go with. You shouldn't keep looking for some analysis that finds the answer you want to give. P-values alone are not helpful. They don't give you any measure of effect size, and they don't give you any measure of the spread of the data. And so I think that some measure of effect size, an odds ratio, a hazard ratio, a number needed to treat, and a confidence interval is a better way to summarize data. I think providing the actual data, the percentages, the ranges, is much more important than providing the stats. The reader is usually pretty good at discerning what's BS and what isn't if you give them the data. So what's the discussion for after all this? I would say the first paragraph of the discussion is useful if it'll restate the general reason why the topic's important, remind the reader of your rationale for this particular study, and then either restate your study questions or their answers, either way. That's a good opening paragraph to a discussion in my mind. I think it's important to put the limitations somewhere, a paragraph that specifically starts with, this study had a number of limitations. Again, make it easy on your reader. Don't just list them. This study was limited because it was a retrospective study. All right, well, fine. You know, some retrospective studies are fantastic. Some retrospective studies are exactly what you need. What is it about this study being retrospective that's a limitation? Is it because it was retrospective and highly selected, or retrospective and you don't know how the patients were selected? Is it because it was retrospective and so we asked kind of different questions over the 20-year period? We didn't have outcomes tools in play the whole way through, so there was some measure of assessment or assessor bias. Is it because it was retrospective and we lost 60% of the patients to follow-up, but there's a lot of transfer bias? What is it that was the problem? Don't just say it was a retrospective study and so it has limitations, you know, that go with all retrospective studies, because they're all different. Then say a little bit about why you think that limitation isn't a disabling limitation. right? Because otherwise the reader may say, oh, well, this is a retrospective study with transfer bias. I'm going to read something else. If you think it's important enough to be published, tell them, yes, we lost 30% of our patients to follow-up, but here's why we think that's not so critical. Probably is critical. But you should give them something to hang on to, that'll help them to interpret your study properly based on these limitations. Then I would say a nice way to structure a discussion section is to write a paragraph of discussion on each of your study questions. Begin those with a topic sentence that refers back to that study question so people know what they're about to read about. And then the idea of those paragraphs is to compare your finding to the findings of others on related topics. If you found something different than other people, try to explain why. Is it a different patient population? You do the technique better than they do? They can't operate worth beans? What is it? If it's the same, if you found something similar to 3 other studies, well, you're in a different situation. Now you've got to convince the editor that even though 3 other people have found the same thing, ours is important. What are some possible reasons for that? Well, the 3 previous studies each had 15 patients. We had 1,500. This is definitive. That's okay. But you've got to cover that issue because they'll find it. They'll know it's in the literature when they're reading this paper. And if 3 other papers found the same thing, they're going to say to you, well, they may not say anything to you other than a rejection letter. So you really do want to get that out front. So if you're different than prior, account for that difference. If you're similar, explain why your study is important. The conclusion, again, don't just restate the results, tell somebody what to do with it. So finally, to wrap things up here, things that didn't really fit anywhere else in this talk, but I think still are probably worth mentioning. Follow the journal's author instructions. You think that makes it easy on the reviewers or the editor, it makes it easy on you. Because if this thing comes in and it's a dog and it doesn't look like anything else in the journal, you're not going to get a second chance. They're going to send it back to you. If it's a dog but it's a properly formatted dog, they may have some queries. They may ask you, can you clarify this? But if it doesn't look like anything else they've seen before, it comes in with no abstract on the front of it, they're not going to try to do a lot of work necessarily to nurse you along unless you're writing from some emerging market where we have infinite patience and want to cultivate more papers from. You write from New York City and you write something that doesn't look like a paper, it's coming back. You write from Seattle and it looks that way, it's coming back. Know the journal's authorship standards. I've described to you ours. The ICMJ is a pretty common standard, but it is not the exclusive standard. And before you start, clarify authorship with your colleagues. We mentioned this earlier. Who's going to be first, who's going to be last, what would result in somebody not remaining an author. Adding an author is always a sensitive thing. It's going to really raise the antenna of a journal if you try to add an author midstream, because almost always authors added midstream didn't really do those things that we said an author should do. Involve a statistician up front if there's any chance you think you'll need one. And finally, the title. How do you title your paper? I think a nice way is a title should either ask a question or give an answer based on your data. That's probably an easy way to think about it. Thanks. So we still have a few minutes for questions if you'd like.
I don't know how we should format our, when the journal not accepts your paper, but says, we have 3 editors look at this and they have their comments.
Mm-hmm.
How do you usually like the response to those be? There's always a question of, do I put my edits, what I cut out, what I put in, is that all in the sentence? Do I send them a big crossed out, red blocked out thing and say this is what I added? It was really confusing.
It's really, so every journal does it a bit differently. What we do, what I do is, as a service to the authors, and I didn't invent this, I'll take the letter, the 3 letters from those 3 reviewers, let's say, and I'll pull out those items that call for an action on the part of the authors. I mean, there's a lot of fluffy stuff. We think this is a fancy study. We like it. It contributes this, that, and the other. It's got some limitations. I'm going to talk about those in a minute. All this expository baloney. But I'm going to pull out the points that the reviewer wants answered, and I'm going to put them into a table. I'm going to send the author that table. And I'm going to say, this is reviewer 1 had these 6 comments. I'd like you to explain to me how you addressed them. I'd like you to give me the line numbers where you addressed them in your paper. And so that's what I do. That makes it a lot easier. Most journals don't take that step, because that step takes me probably 5 or 10 minutes of paper to pour through it and create this tool that makes it easier on the authors. Not every journal will do that. What I would do when I was an author writing for other journals is I would make my own version of that table. I would pull out and I would create a document. It doesn't have to be a table. It can be numbered. Reviewer 1 seemed to have 6 comments. Here they are. And I put his comments in bold and I put my responses below and I would say where I addressed it in the paper. and then I would send it back that way. That's a way to do it, to help the editor know that you took seriously all of the comments. You know, you number them, you list them. You don't have to give them everything they want. You should try. You should be gracious when you don't. You know, although the reviewer's onto a big subject here, an important subject, we don't think that adding this to our paper is going to help because, you know, if you choose not to address a comment, it's important not to just conveniently leave it off your list, but to identify, well, this is something they raised, but we can't answer it, and we don't think it's a critical flaw that we didn't answer it, right? So you have to make that case for why you chose not to answer this question. And it may go back to that reviewer. So you want to make it in a way that's polite, but also conclusive. You know what I'm saying?
How are those people selected? Because like when my response to my paper, they seem so schizophrenic. Like one paper was saying it's great, the next person's saying this article's crap. They're still wanting me to do my edits, and so at least somebody must have liked it. But I don't know how those people are chosen, so I didn't know how to like respond.
You don't know which one's carrying weight with the editor, you mean?
Right.
Right.
But there is obviously the person that liked my paper must have.
And the editor, because he or she is asking you for a revision,
Right.
thinks there's at least a germ of a message there. And so the idea is if it's coming back to you for a revision, there's enough support, at least in principle, that if you do a good job, you may get it published. I remember the very first paper I wrote. I was in my fellowship, and I wrote this paper, and it came back with 3 schizophrenic sets of reviews, some of them rather tersely worded, and direct is the word my wife likes to use. I was heartbroken. I went to Josh Jacobs, who's been a visiting professor. I said, Josh, they hated it. He said, this is a love letter. So it's just a matter of getting used to getting these letters back. Realize that the people reviewing your paper are busy people. Realize that most of them are surgeons, and surgeons have the capacity to be fairly direct. Go to the substance of what they're saying. What are their specific suggestions? What are they actually requesting? After all of the rhetoric, what do they want? What are they telling you need to do? You don't have to respond if they say, you know, I think this is a crappy paper, but here are some suggestions. Just forget they said that. Just look at their suggestions. They're as schizophrenic as you and me, because you and me are them, all right? And it's not a democracy. I can have, if I send it out to 3 reviewers, 2 of them can say accept, 1 of them can say reject. That paper can get rejected if the reject reviewer identified a critical flaw that the others missed. It's nothing like a democracy. And so you don't have to tally votes. How many of these look friendly and warm versus direct? What you really have to do is identify what the specific suggestions were and determine, can you make them? And if you can't make 1 or more of them, explain why you didn't make it and why you don't think it's a disqualifier that you didn't make it. And that's all you have to do. It's really easy to get drawn emotionally into those reviews because it's your baby and they're criticizing it. Just focus, if you can, on the specific things they're asking for. There'll always be divergences. The frequency with which I get 3 rejects or 3 accepts, it's definitely less than 10%. There's always some degree of schizophrenia in it. My job is to decide